A century after its foundation, Yusuf I comes to the throne of the Alhambra. He inherits the mantle of Sultan at a high point in Granada's long-running conflict with the Castilian Christians who occupy much of Spain.
The reign of Yusuf I in the early 14th century is sort of the first high point of the kingdom. Yusuf I allies with the Marinid dynasty in North Africa and appears to be in quite a strong position vis-à-vis the Christian kingdoms to the north.
Alongside his new allies, the Marinids, Yusuf launches an attack into Castilian territory, trying to regain some of the land his forefathers have lost. However, Granada's ascendancy is short-lived. Just 7 years later, King Alfonso of Castile defeats the Muslims at the Battle of the River Salado, forcing Yusuf's allies, the Marinids, to withdraw from Spain for good. This may explain why the last act of Yusuf's reign is to build a huge defensive tower, the biggest yet, on the Alhambra's north wall, the Torre de Comares. This massive tower stands 45 meters tall. It forms the centerpiece of the brand new palace that Yusuf decides to build. In order to shoehorn it into the new palace design, Yusuf's architects have to extend an existing tower on the north wall. They shift the existing sentry walk further north onto a new wall and extend the tower another 12 meters out. But Yusuf isn't thinking of defense. He's thinking of his image. His tower is designed to make a statement. Yusuf I has just suffered a terrible defeat. He decides to build a monument that will reinforce his power and invulnerability in the eyes of his people. By building this tower, Yusuf stamps his authority on his kingdom. But Yusuf isn't just trying to impress his own people. He wants to establish his invulnerability in the minds of his Christian enemies.
The Great Hall in the Palace of the Comares is compensating in a way for a lack of military strength. Because he has to rely on political and diplomatic negotiations, he needs a very impressive space in which to conduct those.
Today, thousands of tourists are overwhelmed by the same sense of awe that Christian ambassadors must have felt when they came to meet the Sultan, because the interior of the complex is designed to make an impression. This is Yusuf's Grand Palace. At its heart, the glory that is the Hall of the Ambassadors. Everything in this overwhelming room is designed to impress. Any visiting ambassador would have been struck by the sheer scale of the Alhambra. The entire edifice is calculated to convey an impression of supreme invincibility. The complex stucco work contains repeated Arabic inscriptions in praise of Allah.
The most prevalent is the motto of the Nasrids, which is, "There is no conqueror but God." And you see that repeated over and over and over again.
The ceiling, 75 feet above, contains more than 8,000 individual pieces of cedar wood, painted to resemble the seven heavens of Islam.
The Comares Tower is a microcosm of the universe, and the Sultan is in control of that. He is, in a sense, in control of the universe, which is quite a bold statement for him to make.
Here lay the central challenge that Yusuf's architects had to face. They had to impress any ambassador who entered this room with the power and presence of the Sultan. To do that, they needed to focus all the attention in the room onto the Sultan's throne.
It's a very striking manipulation of space to emphasize the fact that Yusuf I is a ruler of importance and power, and that he is sort of in control of this kingdom.
To do this, the Alhambra's architects had one thing that could help them: mathematics. When the classical world collapsed, the mathematical knowledge used to build the great monuments of Greece and Rome was collected by Muslim scholars and passed down through the Muslim houses of wisdom to the time of the Alhambra.
So all of the learning of the Greeks and later the Romans is incorporated into Islamic mathematics. They don't reject it because it doesn't threaten their religion. So here we have this classical legacy of mathematics that is not only inherited but then improved upon.
Hispano-Muslim architects used a unit of measurement inherited from classical architecture, called the rashshashid codo. It was about 62 centimeters long, and virtually all of the Alhambra is based on this unit of measurement. This lay at the heart of the Alhambra's design. So, to create a space that will overwhelm visitors with the importance of their sultan, Yusuf's architects design a ground plan 18 rashshashid codos square. They divide the room along its horizontal and diagonal axes. Using string, they mark out 4 90-degree arcs from wall to wall. A straight line between the endpoints of these arcs creates an octagon. This allows them to create a larger square sitting diagonally across the original, which marks the location of the central windows at the entrance. Equilateral triangles drawn from the center of the walls create the perfectly proportioned width of these windows.
It must have been a very intimidating experience to walk into the Hall of the Ambassadors and to see the Sultan positioned there, centrally, commanding that space, and arrayed behind him the panorama of his city and of Granada, but also of his territory. So it must have been very impressive. It must have been calculated to intimidate.
Forbidding both on the inside and the outside, the tower seems to have done its job. No one dared to attack the Alhambra while Yusuf was on the throne. In fact, Yusuf's downfall would come from a completely unexpected source. For with great beauty comes great pain. And before the Alhambra could truly flower, it would endure one of the most traumatic events in its history. 19th of October 1354, more than a century after the Alhambra's foundation, Yusuf I is preparing for his daily prayers. As he does so, he is attacked by a deranged slave. The madman stabs him to death. Yusuf was just 36 years old. His death paves the way for his heir, Muhammad V, to create what may become the Alhambra's greatest monument. Just 5 years into his reign, a court faction tries to assassinate the new sultan. Muhammad flees from his own people and seeks refuge with Granada's oldest enemy, the Christian King of Castile. Despite his nickname, Pedro the Cruel helps Muhammad win back his throne.
Pedro the Cruel and Muhammad V clearly had a friendship which was based to some extent on shared intellectual and artistic interests. One could imagine that the two men could have had a genuine friendship beyond the politics of the era, and I think that just underlines the point that we shouldn't think of Christians and Muslims as always at loggerheads.
His friendship with Muhammad will change the Alhambra forever. Like many Spanish kings, Pedro is profoundly impressed by the beauty of Muslim architecture. So when he builds a new palace in Seville, he models it on the Muslim pattern.
And when Muhammad finally is returned to the throne and goes back to Granada, he spent several years in the company of another architectural fan discussing architecture, and he brings many of the ideas that were developed in Seville back to Granada with him. This is very interesting because it means that the building that we consider the high point of Islamic architecture in Spain owes a debt to a Christian palace in Seville.
When he returns to the Alhambra, Muhammad is determined to outdo Pedro's masterpiece in Seville. and his triumphant response will be an architectural tour de force. With its magnificent courtyard and breathtaking ceilings, Mohammed V's palace will prove to be more beautiful, more sophisticated, and more accomplished than the Muslim-style masterpiece of his powerful Christian neighbor. Under the reign of Mohammed V, the age-old rivalry between Granada and Castile takes a radically different course. Thanks to his friendship with Pedro of Castile, military confrontation transforms into an artistic competition. Mohammed commissions the exquisite palace and Court of the Lions, which seeks to emulate and surpass the beauty of Pedro's palace in Seville.
It represents a different pattern of palace, more complex than the other ones, because it has influences of both Islamic and Christian architecture at the same time.
The Court of the Lions, for many people, is the high point of Nasrid architecture and the high point of Islamic architecture in Spain. It is spatially complex, luxurious, refined, and it brings it all together in one exquisite space.
Here is the crown jewel of the Alhambra, built according to a set of rectangles, each related to the other. Once again, Mohammed's architects used geometry to brilliant effect.
When we look at the facade, what we see is a base width used to form a square, which defines the next level up. And then we take the diagonal on that square, swing it through to the vertical, and the point at the end of the diagonal hits the vertical, becomes the next floor. We then do exactly the same on a diagonal from this corner. So what you're getting is a very precise relationship between one story height and the next in accordance with Greek rules. Now this looks right to us because the way that Greek architecture has come down to us defines our sense of beauty. We look at Greek buildings and they feel right to us because they're presented as beautiful artifacts.
Despite these Western influences, the Palace of the Lions remains a resolutely Eastern building.
When we see it today, we don't really see it as it was. The four quadrants around the central fountain were actually sunken flower beds.
The flower beds were encircled by the salons of the Sultan's wives, which overlooked the central garden.
You would have had people sitting around the edges of the court on cushions or carpets, looking out and just seeing the tops of plants and shrubs and trees.
These rooms contain the palace's most spectacular treasure, an exquisite form of decoration known as mokarabes.
That is absolutely unique to Islam. It's hard to explain where it comes from. It's hard to even understand it when you see it. It is so dazzling, it confounds the senses.
You have a sense that it's not weight-bearing, that it's hardly there. It almost seems to move as you look at it because of the interplay of light and shade on these small stalactite-like elements.
And again, it's mathematics that creates this astounding intricacy. There's an exact geometry to the pattern, which uses triangles and rectangular blocks to create its effects. The variety of cuts in the plasterwork creates different geometrical shapes, called adarajas. These are set into the wall of the building with clay, ready for painting.
The plasterwork is very complex, not only because the constant play between solid and void, but also it was originally painted. It was bright red, bright blue, so it would have been a very vibrant experience.
The painters use exotic pigments, among them blue lazurite, extracted from lapis lazuli in Afghanistan, which cost as much as gold.
It's as if the rules of existence had been completely changed, because overhead is this vault that you cannot comprehend. You actually cannot understand what the spatial dimensions are. There is no fixed point up there that you can focus your eyes. It is an extraordinary sensory experience.
This was to prove the high point for the Muslim Kingdom of Granada.